The deafening crack of thunder coincided with the ancient oak's splintering descent, sending a cascade of timber and branches down the muddy embankment where Delilah Granger had sought refuge from the sudden prairie storm. As the massive trunk crashed mere inches from where she stood, Delilah found herself trapped in a natural prison of wood and debris, the rain-slicked walls of the ravine offering no escape route. South Dakota Territory, 1876. The Black Hills Gold Rush had drawn thousands to the untamed wilderness surrounding Deadwood and beyond. Delilah, 22 and determined, had come west not for gold, but for independence. The daughter of a Boston businessman, she had abandoned a life of arranged marriages and suffocating expectations for the promise of teaching at a newly established school near Sioux Falls. The storm had caught her unaware during her journey. Her horse had spooked at a lightning strike, throwing her from the saddle before bolting away with most of her supplies. The ravine had seemed like protection from the driving rain until the ancient oak surrendered to the fury of the storm. "Hello, is anybody there?" Delilah called out, her voice nearly lost amid the drumming rain. She pushed against the massive trunk, but it refused to budge even an inch. Her skirts were soaked through, her traveling coat heavy with water, and her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in wet tangles around her face. The crack of a twig alerted her to another presence. Delilah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer she kept hidden in her coat pocket, the one concession her father had insisted upon when she announced her intention to travel west alone. "Whoa there, miss, no need for that." The deep voice came from above her. At the edge of the ravine, squinting through the rain, Delilah made out the silhouette of a man against the stormy sky. Broad-shouldered and tall, he wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. The collar of his duster was turned up against the weather, but she could see he had a rifle slung across his back. "Are you hurt?" he called down, already beginning to make his way carefully down the slippery slope. "I'm uninjured," Delilah replied, still clutching the derringer, but thoroughly trapped. The man reached the bottom of the ravine and approached the fallen tree cautiously. Up close, Delilah could see his face weathered by sun and wind, with several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His eyes, however, were startlingly clear, the color of the summer sky after a rainstorm. "Name's Ethan Archer," he said, removing his hat briefly in a gesture of courtesy that seemed almost comically formal given their surroundings. Water dripped from the brim as he replaced it. "Looks like you've found yourself in quite a predicament, miss." "Granger. Delilah Granger," she replied, finally letting her hand fall away from the hidden pistol. Something in his demeanor suggested he was no threat, at least not the immediate kind. "My horse threw me and ran off with most of my supplies. I was seeking shelter when this tree decided to come crashing down." Ethan examined the massive trunk and the way it had wedged itself against the ravine wall, creating a barricade that effectively imprisoned Delilah in a small pocket of space. "Well, Miss Granger," he said, measuring the situation with a practiced eye, "I reckon we can get you out of this fix." He looked up at the sky, judging the time through the storm clouds. "You'll walk free before nightfall, that I can promise you. I appreciate your confidence, Mr. Archer, but this tree must weigh several tons." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've moved stubborn cattle and broken wagons out of worse spots. This is just another puzzle waiting to be solved." He shrugged out of his duster and draped it over a nearby branch, revealing a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt. The handle of a Colt revolver protruded from a holster at his hip. "Are you a lawman?" Delilah asked, nodding toward the weapon. "No, madam, just a man who values being prepared." He studied the fallen tree again. "I was a cavalry scout during the war, worked as a ranch hand after. These days I run a small freight business out of Sioux Falls." He glanced at her with curiosity. "And what brings a Boston lady out to Dakota Territory? Your accent gives you away." Delilah straightened her shoulders. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Sioux Falls. And I'd prefer not to arrive on my first day looking like a drowned rat who's been sleeping in a ravine." Ethan laughed, a rich sound that somehow made the dismal situation seem less dire. "Fair enough. Let's get to work then. For the next hour, Ethan labored to free her. First, he tried using a sturdy branch as a lever, wedging it under the trunk and pushing with all his might. The tree shifted slightly but remained firmly in place. Next, he attempted to dig away the earth beneath the trunk where it met the ravine wall, hoping to create enough space for Delilah to squeeze through. The rain had stopped, but water continued to trickle down the ravine walls, turning Ethan's excavation efforts into a muddy mess. Delilah wasn't one to stand idly by, and she soon joined in the digging, using a broken branch as a makeshift shovel. "You're not like most Eastern ladies I've encountered," Ethan remarked as they worked side by side. "Is that a compliment or an observation, Mr. Archer? Both, I suppose." He paused in his digging. Most would be weeping or demanding to be rescued like some princess from a fairy tale. Delilah smiled despite herself. "I've found tears rarely solve practical problems. Besides, I didn't come west to be coddled." "Why did you come west?" He resumed digging, but his eyes remained on her. Delilah considered the question. "Freedom, perhaps. In Boston, my life was predetermined. My father had my future mapped out: marriage to a business associate twice my age, a grand house where I'd host dinner parties and produce heirs. I wanted more. And you think you'll find more teaching in a frontier town? I know I will. Out here, I can build something of my own, make my own decisions, live by my own choices." Ethan nodded slowly. "The West has a way of testing those choices. It's not always kind." "Neither is a father who sees his daughter as a business transaction," Delilah replied, more sharply than she'd intended. A few more minutes of digging proved the approach futile. The muddy earth kept collapsing back into their excavation, and the tree remained firmly in place. "This isn't working," Ethan finally admitted, wiping mud from his hands onto his already dirty trousers. "We need a different approach." He stood back, studying the situation with narrowed eyes. "The root end is what's causing the problem. It's wedged too tightly against that rock formation. If we had a way to move it just a few inches." "What about your horse?" Delilah suggested. "Could we use it to pull the tree?" "My gelding's strong, but not that strong. Besides, he's skittish around fallen timber since a close call with a wildfire last summer." Ethan looked thoughtful. "But I know where we might find help. There's a logging camp about 2 miles from here. They'll have the tools and manpower we need." "But that would mean leaving me here," Delilah pointed out, "only for a short while. I'm a fast rider." Delilah glanced at the darkening sky. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less if the camp hasn't moved on." He hesitated. "I don't like leaving you alone, but it's our best chance of getting you free before dark." "I'll be fine," Delilah assured him, though the prospect of being left alone as evening approached was unsettling. "I have my derringer after all," Ethan smiled. "So I noticed. Do you know how to use it?" Point and pull the trigger. It seemed straightforward enough. "There's a bit more to it than that, but it'll do in a pinch." He retrieved his duster and offered it to her. "Take this." The temperature drops quickly once the sun starts to set. Delilah accepted the coat with quiet gratitude. It was still damp from the rain, but would provide some warmth. As she slipped it on, she caught the scent of tobacco, leather, and something distinctly masculine. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Ethan promised, already climbing up the ravine slope. "Try to stay dry, Mr. Archer," Delilah called after him. He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and disappeared over the ridge. Alone, Delilah tried to make herself as comfortable as possible in her small prison. She was cold, hungry, and increasingly worried about what nightfall might bring to this unfamiliar wilderness. The ravine had seemed like a good shelter during the storm, but now she realized it could easily become a trap for more than just falling trees. What if the rain returned and flooded the depression? What if wild animals came searching for shelter? To distract herself, she tried to remember the route they had planned to take to Sioux Falls. She had been traveling with a freight wagon for most of the journey, but had separated from them that morning, believing she could make better time on horseback. The decision now seemed foolishly impulsive. As the shadows lengthened and the forest grew quiet, Delilah began to wonder if Ethan would return at all. Perhaps he had simply been kind enough to offer reassurance before continuing on his way. After all, what obligation did a stranger have to a woman foolish enough to get herself trapped in a ravine? The snapping of twigs made her heart race, and she fumbled for the derringer in her pocket. The sound of hooves' multiple sets filtered down into the ravine, followed by men's voices. "Down here," came Ethan's familiar call. "Watch your step on the slope, it's still slippery." Relief washed over Delilah as Ethan appeared at the ravine's edge, followed by 3 burly men carrying axes and a coiled length of heavy rope. "Miss Granger," Ethan called down, "I've brought some help." "These gentlemen are from Hanson's logging camp." The men made their way carefully down to the ravine floor, greeting Delilah with respectful nods and removed hats. "Madam," said the oldest of the group, a gray-bearded man with massive forearms, "name's Jacob Hanson. Ethan here says you've got yourself pinned by one of my trees." "Your trees, Mr. Hanson? We've been clearing this section of forest for the railroad," he explained. "This old oak was marked for tomorrow's cutting. Seems the storm did our work for us, though not quite where we'd planned." Under Hanson's direction, the men quickly set to work. 2 of them used axes to clear away the smaller branches, while the third prepared a pulley system using the rope and a nearby sturdy tree. Ethan moved back and forth between them, lending a hand where needed and occasionally checking on Delilah. "You doing all right?" he asked during one such check, passing her a canteen of water. "Better now," she admitted, taking a grateful sip. "I was beginning to think you might not return." Something like hurt flashed across his features. "I gave my word." "Yes, you did. I apologize for doubting you." Within an hour, the loggers had cleared away enough of the smaller branches and set up their pulley system. Hanson's team hitched the rope to a pair of draft horses brought specifically for the task. "Stand back as far as you can, Miss Granger," Hanson instructed. "When we pull, that tree might shift unpredictably." Delilah pressed herself against the ravine wall as the men coordinated their efforts. At Hanson's signal, the horses strained forward, the rope went taut, and the massive trunk groaned in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden lurch, the tree shifted several inches. "Again," Hanson called, and the horses pulled once more. This time, the trunk moved enough to create a gap between it and the ravine wall, a gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. "Now, Miss Granger," Ethan called, extending his hand through the opening. Delilah didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand and pulled herself through the narrow gap, scraping her arms and tearing her dress in the process. As soon as she was clear, the men released the tension on the rope, and the tree settled back with a dull thud. Standing on shaky legs in the open space of the ravine floor, Delilah found herself still holding Ethan's hand. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Thank you," she said softly, reluctantly releasing his hand. "I told you you'd walk free before nightfall," he replied with a smile. The loggers helped them climb out of the ravine as dusk settled over the forest. Hanson offered Delilah a place at their camp for the night, which she gratefully accepted. "We can help you search for your horse in the morning," he added. "Animals often return to the last place they found water or food." The logging camp was basic but organized, with several canvas tents arranged around a central fire pit. The cook, a wiry man named Peterson, provided Delilah with a plate of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, simple fare that tasted like a feast after her ordeal. Ethan sat beside her at the fire, nursing a cup of coffee. "You should get some rest," he suggested. "Peterson's clearing a space in the supply tent for you. It's not the Willard Hotel, but it's dry." "What about you? Will you stay?" He nodded. "I'm headed to Sioux Falls myself. Figured we could travel together tomorrow, assuming we find your horse. If not, you can ride double with me for a stretch." The prospect of continuing her journey with Ethan brought an unexpected sense of relief. "I'd be grateful for the company." Later, lying on a makeshift bed of canvas and blankets in the supply tent, Delilah found herself thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought Ethan Archer into her life. Had the tree not fallen, had her horse not spooked, she would likely be miles closer to Sioux Falls by now and would never have met the quiet cowboy with the sky-blue eyes who had promised her freedom before nightfall and then delivered on that promise. Sleep claimed her quickly, exhaustion overriding the discomfort of her improvised accommodations. Her dreams were a confused jumble of falling trees, rushing water, and a pair of steady hands reaching through the chaos to find hers. Morning arrived with the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Delilah emerged from the tent to find the camp already bustling with activity. Loggers were preparing for the day's work. The cook was frying salt pork over the fire, and Ethan was deep in conversation with Hanson, both men studying what appeared to be a crude map drawn in the dirt. "Ah, the lady emerges," Hanson said, noticing her approach. "Hope you slept well, Miss Granger." "Better than I expected, thank you," Delilah replied, accepting a tin cup of coffee from Peterson. Ethan straightened up. "We've been discussing the best place to look for your horse. Hanson thinks there's a meadow about a mile east that often attracts stray animals, good grazing, and a small stream. Some of my men spotted horse tracks heading that direction when they came back to camp last night," Hanson added. After a quick breakfast, Ethan saddled his gelding, a sturdy buckskin with intelligent eyes, and helped Delilah mount behind him. The sensation of sitting so close, her arms necessarily wrapped around his waist for stability, created a strange intimacy between them. "Hold tight," he instructed as they set off. "Buck here has an easy gait, but the trail's rough in places." They rode through the morning mist, following a faint trail that wound through the forest. The loggers had been right. They found Delilah's bay mare grazing contentedly in the meadow, still saddled though the saddlebags were missing. "She seems no worse for her adventure," Ethan commented as they approached the horse carefully. "Unlike her rider," Delilah replied wryly. The mare allowed herself to be caught without much resistance, apparently having worked through her fear during the night. Delilah's saddle was intact, but as suspected, the saddlebags containing most of her supplies were gone, likely torn off during the horse's panicked flight. "We can share my provisions," Ethan offered as they prepared to continue their journey. "Sioux Falls is only about a day's ride from here if we make good time." With both mounted on their own horses, they set out for Sioux Falls, following a trail that gradually widened into a more established road. As they rode, Delilah found herself studying her companion. In the clear light of morning, she could see the details she had missed the previous day: the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the confident ease with which he sat in the saddle. "You're staring, Miss Granger," Ethan said without turning around, amusement coloring his voice. Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was merely assessing my rescuer in the daylight, and your assessment? You seem to know your way around these parts well." Ethan chuckled. "That's not an assessment, that's an observation." "Very well. My assessment is that you are a man accustomed to solving problems and keeping your word, both admirable qualities, high praise from a Boston lady." "I'd prefer you didn't call me that. I left Boston behind for a reason." Ethan glanced over his shoulder at her, expression thoughtful. "Fair enough, Miss Granger. Or would you prefer Delilah, seeing as we've shared an adventure already?" The informal address should have scandalized her, but Delilah found she didn't mind. Delilah would be acceptable, given the circumstances. Ethan. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate yet right somehow. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves creating a soothing backdrop. Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest the horses and eat some of the provisions. Ethan had packed jerky, hardtack, and dried apples. "How did you come to be in the freight business?" Delilah asked as they sat on a fallen log, watching the horses drink. Ethan took a bite of jerky before answering. "After the war, I drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives from Texas up to Kansas, did some scouting for the Army around Fort Laramie, eventually made my way to Dakota Territory when the gold rush started." He shrugged. "Found out pretty quick I wasn't cut out for prospecting, but I noticed there was good money in moving supplies from the Missouri River settlements to the mining camps. You own your own wagons, 2 wagons, 6 mules, and Buck there. It's a small operation, but it keeps me fed and provides enough to set a little aside." "For what?" Delilah asked, curious. "Land," Ethan replied simply. "Looking to buy a parcel west of Sioux Falls. Good water, decent grazing, might raise horses eventually. You'd stop freighting." Not right away, but eventually, yes. He looked at her with curiosity. What about you? Teaching school in Sioux Falls, is that your final destination or just another stop? Delilah considered the question. I haven't thought that far ahead. For now, it's enough to be establishing myself independently. The town's growing fast. Railroad's supposed to reach it by next year. It'll be a good place for a new start. Have you lived there long? About 2 years. I use it as my base of operations, have a small cabin on the edge of town. Delilah tried to picture Ethan in a settled domestic setting and found the image strangely appealing. Do you have family there? He shook his head. No family anywhere, not anymore. Parents died when I was young. Was raised by an uncle who didn't much care for the burden. He's long gone too. I'm sorry, Delilah said softly. Ethan shrugged again, but she sensed the casual gesture masked deeper feelings. It's the way of things out here. People come and go. You learn to make your own way. They resumed their journey after the brief rest, the terrain gradually changing from forest to rolling prairie. Occasionally, they passed other travelers, a wagon filled with a family moving west, a pair of riders heading east toward the river settlements, a lone peddler with a mule laden with goods. Each encounter reminded Delilah that she was entering a new world, one where the rigid social structures of Boston would mean little. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, threatening another storm. We should find shelter before that hits, Ethan said, eyeing the sky with concern. There's a way station about an hour's ride from here, not much comfort, but it's solid enough to keep out the rain. The way station turned out to be a crude log structure with a single room that served as both living quarters and store. It was operated by a grizzled old-timer named Hawkins, who seemed genuinely pleased to have company. Don't get many folks this time of year, he explained as he showed them inside. Most travelers come through in spring or fall. Summer's too hot, winter's too deadly. For a small fee, he provided them with a hot meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, along with space in the stable for their horses. The interior of the station was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a few crude chairs, and shelves stocked with basic supplies for travelers. Only got the one bed, Hawkins informed them, nodding toward a narrow cot in the corner, but plenty of floor space. Got extra blankets too. The lady will take the bed, Ethan said immediately. I'm accustomed to rougher accommodations. Delilah began to protest, but a crash of thunder silenced her objection. The storm had arrived, rain lashing against the single window and drumming on the shake roof. Reminds me of yesterday, she said quietly as they sat before the fire after their meal, Hawkins having retreated to his small private room at the back of the structure. Except you're not trapped behind a fallen tree, Ethan pointed out with a smile. No, thanks to you. She hesitated, then added, I never properly thanked you for going out of your way to help a stranger. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true. Delilah gazed into the fire. Many would have simply ridden on, especially in that weather. Ethan's eyes reflected the flickering flames as he studied her. Perhaps I was curious about the woman who sought shelter in a ravine during a thunderstorm. It seemed sensible at the time. Most bad decisions do. There was no judgment in his tone, only gentle amusement. They talked late into the night, the storm providing a natural soundtrack to their conversation. Delilah shared stories of her childhood in Boston, the pressures of society life, and her decision to break free. Ethan spoke of his years as a cavalry scout, the hardships of the war, and his wandering life afterward. I've never really belonged anywhere, he admitted during a lull in their conversation. Always just passing through. And yet you're saving for land, Delilah pointed out. That suggests a desire to put down roots. Maybe I'm just tired of moving. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. Or maybe I'm getting old enough to want something that's mine. You're hardly old. 32 next month. In frontier years, that's getting up there. Delilah laughed. Then what does that make Mr. Hawkins? Ancient, Ethan replied with a grin. Practically a historical monument. Their laughter seemed to fill the small space, creating a bubble of warmth that had little to do with the fire. For the first time since leaving Boston, Delilah felt genuinely at ease, not performing the role of the proper lady or the independent pioneer, but simply being herself. When she finally retired to the narrow cot, leaving Ethan to make his bed on the floor near the fire, Delilah found herself wondering what would happen when they reached Sioux Falls. Would they simply go their separate ways? The thought produced an unexpected pang of regret. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that they were less than half a day's ride from Sioux Falls. They set out after a simple breakfast, Hawkins sending them off with fresh cornbread for the journey. "The schoolhouse is on the north side of town," Ethan explained as they rode. "It's new built just last year. The town council's been trying to attract a teacher for months." "Have you seen it?" Delilah asked. "Helped build it, actually. The town organized a raising bee last summer. Most everyone pitched in." "Do they know I'm coming?" Word travels fast out here. "I imagine they've been preparing for your arrival since you accepted the position." He glanced at her. "Nervous?" "A little," Delilah admitted. "In Boston, I assisted at a girl's finishing school for a year. This will be quite different. You'll have boys and girls of all ages, some who have never had formal schooling. Many of them work on farms or in shops when they're not in school. Will they accept instruction from an Easterner?" Ethan considered this. "They'll be curious at first, probably test you some. But frontier children understand the value of education better than most. They see firsthand how illiteracy and innumeracy can limit a person's options." As they crested a gentle rise, the town of Sioux Falls came into view, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the Big Sioux River. Unlike the primitive settlements Delilah had passed through on her journey west, Sioux Falls had an air of permanence and prosperity. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and several substantial brick buildings lined what appeared to be the main street. "It's larger than I expected," Delilah remarked, surprised. "Growing every month," Ethan confirmed. "The falls provide power for mills, and the surrounding land is good for farming. Once the railroad comes through next year, it'll grow even faster." They rode down the slope toward town, passing scattered homesteads and cultivated fields. As they approached the outskirts, Delilah became aware of the curious glances from people. They passed a woman drawing water from a well, a farmer mending a fence, children playing in a yard. "Word spreading that the new schoolteacher has arrived," Ethan said with a chuckle. "By the time we reach Main Street, half the town will know." He wasn't exaggerating. As they rode down the town's main thoroughfare, people emerged from stores and workshops to watch their passage. Some called greetings to Ethan, who responded with friendly nods or brief words. "Where should we go first?" Delilah asked, feeling increasingly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance after 2 days on the trail. "The boarding house," Ethan decided. "Mrs. Hollister is expecting you. The school board arranged for your accommodation there." The Hollister boarding house was a tidy 2-story structure painted white with green trim. As they dismounted in front, the door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with a welcoming smile. "You must be Miss Granger," she said, coming down the steps to greet them. "We were beginning to worry when you didn't arrive yesterday. I encountered some difficulties on the trail," Delilah explained, shooting a grateful glance at Ethan. "Mr. Archer was kind enough to assist me, Mrs." Hollister's eyes twinkled as she looked between them. "How fortunate you were in the right place at the right time, Ethan." As usual, Ethan tipped his hat. "Just doing my civic duty, Mrs. Hollister. Couldn't have our new school teacher lost in the wilderness, could we?" "Indeed not." "Now come inside, Miss Granger. You must be exhausted. I've prepared the front room for you, best one in the house, with a view of the street." Ethan unloaded Delilah's few remaining belongings from her saddle. "I'll see to your horse," he offered. "The livery stable's just down the street." "Thank you, Ethan." Delilah hesitated, suddenly reluctant to part ways. "Will I see you again before you leave town?" Something in his expression softened. "I live here, remember? I'm not going anywhere." "Of course." Delilah felt foolish for the question, but pleased by his answer. "The school board will want to meet you," he added. "Probably tomorrow, once you've had a chance to rest. I can come by in the morning to show you around town if you'd like." "I'd like that very much, Mrs." Hollister watched this exchange with poorly concealed interest, her smile growing wider by the moment. "Well then," Ethan said, gathering his horse's reins, "until tomorrow, Miss Granger. Until tomorrow, Mr. Archer." As she watched him lead both horses down the street toward the livery stable, Delilah was struck by how different her arrival in Sioux Falls was from what she had imagined. Instead of entering town alone, unknown and uncertain, she had arrived with a connection already formed, a friendly face in a sea of strangers. Mrs. Hollister ushered her inside, chattering about hot baths and clean clothes and a proper meal. The boarding house was comfortable and well-maintained, with polished floors and curtained windows. Delilah's room was indeed pleasant, simply furnished but bright and airy. "There's a community welcome planned for you on Sunday after church, Mrs. Hollister informed her as she helped Delilah unpack her few belongings. "Everyone's excited to meet the new teacher. It's been almost a year since we had proper schooling for the children." "What happened to the previous teacher?" Delilah asked, Miss Abernathy. "She married a cattle buyer from Omaha and moved east." Mrs. Hollister shook her head. "That's the trouble with hiring young women as teachers. They have a tendency to get married just when they're getting good at the job." Delilah smiled. "I can assure you, Mrs. Hollister, I have no immediate plans to marry." "So you say now, dear." The older woman patted her arm. "But Sioux Falls has its share of eligible gentlemen. And speaking of gentlemen, how exactly did you come to be traveling with Ethan Archer?" Delilah explained about the storm, the fallen tree, and Ethan's timely arrival. "That sounds like Ethan," Mrs. Hollister said when she had finished. "Always helping someone in need. He's well respected in these parts, you know. Honest in his business dealings, generous with his time. Keeps to himself mostly, but always there when the town needs him. You know him well. He takes his meals here 3 times a week, says my biscuits remind him of his mother's." Mrs. Hollister looked thoughtful. "It's a shame he's alone. A man like that should have a family." Before Delilah could respond to this obvious hint, Mrs. Hollister continued, "Now I'll have a bath brought up for you. Dinner's at 6, but I can bring a tray to your room if you prefer to rest." "Thank you, but I think I'd like to join the other boarders for dinner. It would be good to meet some of my neighbors." After Mrs. Hollister departed, Delilah moved to the window, watching the activity on the street below. Sioux Falls was clearly a town on the rise, busy, purposeful, growing. She had made the right decision in coming here, she was certain of it. And yet, as she unpacked her few belongings and prepared for her bath, she found her thoughts returning not to the school or her future pupils, but to Ethan Archer and his promise to return in the morning. Dinner at the boarding house introduced Delilah to some of the town's residents, the bank clerk, a widowed shopkeeper, a young couple waiting for their house to be completed, and an elderly physician gradually transferring his practice to a younger doctor. All were welcoming, eager to hear about Boston and her journey west, and full of advice about life in Sioux Falls. "The winters are brutal," warned Dr. Henley, passing her a plate of roasted potatoes. "Stock up on coal and warm clothing before the first snow flies." "The children are lively but good-hearted," added Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's widow. "My grandson will be in your class, little terror but smart as a whip." By the time the meal ended, Delilah's head was swimming with names, faces, and advice. She excused herself early, claiming fatigue from her journey, and retreated to her room. Sleep came quickly, but her dreams were once again filled with falling trees and steady hands reaching through the chaos to find hers. Ethan arrived promptly at 9 the next morning, riding a fresh horse and dressed in clean clothes. His dark hair was damp and neatly combed, and he had shaved off the trail stubble, revealing a strong jawline. Delilah, who had taken extra care with her own appearance that morning, felt a flutter of something that wasn't entirely proper for a schoolteacher to feel toward a man she barely knew. "Good morning," he greeted her as she came out onto the boarding house porch. "Ready for the grand tour?" "More than ready," she replied, noting with pleasure that he had brought a second horse for her, a gentle-looking sorrel mare. "Borrowed her from the livery," Ethan explained as he helped Delilah mount. "Figured you might want to replace your bay after her skittish performance." "That's very thoughtful. Is she for sale?" "Could be. Belongs to Jeb Wilson at the livery. He's always trading horses. I can speak to him if you're interested." They set off down Main Street, Ethan pointing out the various businesses: the general store, the bank, the assay office, the newspaper office, the 2 competing saloons. "Town's growing so fast they had to build a second saloon last year," Ethan explained with a grin. Old Miners Rest couldn't handle the Saturday night crowd anymore. They rode past the church, a white clapboard building with a tall steeple and the doctor's office, then turned north toward the edge of town. "The school's just ahead," Ethan said, nodding toward a substantial log building set in a clearing. "Bigger than most frontier schools, the town council has ambitions." The schoolhouse was indeed impressive for a frontier settlement, well constructed with a proper shingled roof, glass windows, and a small bell tower. A sign above the door proclaimed it Sioux Falls School ESD, 1875. "It's wonderful," Delilah said, genuinely pleased. She had half expected a crude, dirt-floored cabin. Wait until you see inside. Ethan dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. The interior of the school was spacious and bright, with 2 rows of sturdy desks facing a larger teacher's desk on a raised platform. A blackboard covered most of one wall, and a pot-bellied stove stood ready in the corner. "The stove works well," Ethan assured her. "Had some trouble with the chimney drawing properly at first, but we fixed that before winter set in. Town effort. I told you, everyone pitched in." He crossed to a bookshelf containing perhaps 24 volumes, libraries small but growing. "The Ladies' Auxiliary raises funds for new books every year." Delilah ran her fingers along the desks, imagining them filled with students. "How many children will I be teaching?" 28 at last count. Ages 6 to 16. Some only come when farm work allows, especially the older boys. "And they've been without formal instruction for a year. Miss Abernathy left last June. Since then, some of the parents have taken turns keeping the children's learning going, but it's been haphazard." Delilah nodded, mentally cataloging the challenges she would face: different ages, different levels of education, likely some resistance to authority after a year of irregular schooling. "Worried?" Ethan asked, watching her. "Challenged," she corrected him, "but in a good way." They spent another hour exploring the town, Ethan introducing her to shopkeepers and residents they encountered. Everyone seemed genuinely pleased to meet the new schoolteacher, often mentioning children or grandchildren who would be in her class. At the general store, the proprietor, a jovial man named Miller, insisted on showing her the school supplies he had ordered in anticipation of her arrival. "Slates, chalk, primers, copybooks, everything a proper school needs," he said proudly, leading her to a display at the back of the store. "And I've set aside a special order catalog for you, Miss Granger. Anything you need that I don't stock, we can order from St. Louis or Chicago." "That's very kind, Mr. Miller. Not kindness, good business," he replied with a wink. "Educated children become successful adults who need more goods. I'm investing in my future customers." As they left the store, Ethan asked, "Would you like to see where you'll be living once the school term starts?" Delilah looked at him in confusion. "I understood I'd be boarding with Mrs. Hollister." "That's just temporary. The school comes with a teacher's residence, small but private. It's being finished now. Should be ready by the time classes begin." He led her to a neat cabin about 100 yards from the schoolhouse. It was smaller than the school but built with the same care: a single room with a stone fireplace, a small attached lean-to for storage, and a covered porch. "The furniture's simple but solid," Ethan explained as they entered. "Bed, table, chairs, washstand, stove for cooking and heating." Delilah walked around the small space, already imagining how she might arrange her few possessions to make it home. "It's perfect. It's basic," Ethan corrected her. "But I suppose compared to being trapped behind a fallen tree in a rainstorm." Delilah laughed. "I'm finding that my standards for comfort have become much more reasonable since leaving Boston. Frontier living will do that." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, she noticed not for the first time. They ate a simple lunch at the hotel restaurant, the best meal in town according to Ethan, and then rode back toward the center of town. As they passed the newspaper office, the door opened and a tall, distinguished-looking man emerged. "Ethan." "Just the man I wanted to see," he called out, approaching them. "Judge Taylor," Ethan greeted him, tipping his hat. "Allow me to introduce Miss Delilah Granger, our new schoolteacher. Delilah, this is Judge William Taylor, head of the school board and unofficial mayor of Sioux Falls." Miss Granger, a pleasure. The judge removed his hat and bowed slightly. We're delighted you've arrived safely. I understand from Mrs. Hollister that you had some trouble on the trail, a minor mishap during the storm, Delilah replied. Mr. Archer was kind enough to assist me. Fortunate indeed. The judge's gaze moved between them with interest. The board would like to meet with you tomorrow morning if that's convenient, 10 o'clock at my office. Of course, I look forward to it. Excellent. Ethan, a word before you go. Business matter regarding your next freight run. Ethan nodded. I'll be right with you. As the judge retreated a few paces to give them privacy, Ethan turned to Delilah. I should see what the judge wants. Can you find your way back to the boarding house? I believe so. It's just 3 blocks that way, isn't it? She pointed down the street. That's right. I'll come by this evening if I may. There's a social at the church, nothing formal, just music and refreshments. Thought you might like to meet more of the townspeople. I'd like that very much. After seeing Ethan disappear into the judge's office, Delilah made her way back to the boarding house, her mind full of impressions and information. Sioux Falls was clearly a community that valued education, judging by the resources they had devoted to the school. And the people seemed genuinely welcoming, far different from the suspicious, rough-edged frontier town she had half expected. Mrs. Hollister was delighted to hear about the evening social. It's the perfect opportunity for you to meet everyone, she declared, helping Delilah select an appropriate dress from her limited wardrobe. The whole town turns out for these events. Will there be dancing? Delilah asked, suddenly conscious of her appearance. Sometimes, though not always formal dancing, more often it's just music and conversation with some games for the younger folk. Mrs. Hollister gave her a knowing look. Ethan's quite a good dancer, as it happens, surprising in a man who spends so much time on the trail. Delilah felt her cheeks warm. I wasn't asking because of Mr. Archer. Of course not, dear, Mrs. Hollister replied, not bothering to hide her smile. Now let's see what we can do with your hair. Ethan arrived promptly at 7, dressed in what was clearly his best, a dark coat over a clean white shirt with a string tie at his collar. His boots were polished, and he had again taken the trouble to shave, though his dark hair still had a tendency to curl somewhat rebelliously. You look lovely, he said simply when Delilah came down the stairs in her blue dress, one of the few she had brought that was suitable for social occasions. Thank you. You're quite presentable yourself, she replied, trying for lightness despite the flutter in her stomach. The church was already filled with people when they arrived, the pews pushed back against the walls to create an open space. A trio of musicians, fiddle, guitar, and harmonica played lively tunes while children ran about and adults conversed in small groups. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation, followed by a flurry of introductions as people came forward to meet the new schoolteacher. Delilah soon lost track of names and faces, though she tried her best to remember the parents of children who would be her pupils. Throughout it all, Ethan remained at her side, occasionally supplying a forgotten name or explaining a local reference. His presence was reassuring, an anchor in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Miss Granger is from Boston, he would explain when questions about her background arose. Came west to teach because she believes in the importance of education on the frontier. It was a simplified version of her story, but accurate enough. Delilah appreciated that he never mentioned her family situation or her desire to escape predetermined expectations. As the evening progressed, the music grew livelier, and some of the younger people began to dance in the cleared space. It wasn't the formal cotillions and waltzes of Boston society, but rather energetic reels and square dances that required more enthusiasm than precision. Would you care to join them? Ethan asked after they had watched for a while. I'm not familiar with these dances, Delilah admitted. They're not difficult to learn. The main rule is to keep moving and try not to collide with anyone. Before she could object further, he had taken her hand and led her into the forming set for a Virginia reel. The steps were indeed simpler than the formal dances she had learned in Boston, and soon Delilah found herself enjoying the lively movement, the changing partners, and especially the moments when the pattern brought her back to Ethan. You're a natural, he told her during one such moment, his hand warm around hers as they turned. "You're a good teacher," she returned, breathless from the pace. They danced 3 more sets before taking a break for refreshments, lemonade, and cookies provided by the church ladies. Finding a quiet corner, they watched as the dancing continued. "Are all town gatherings this lively?" Delilah asked, sipping her lemonade. "Pretty much. People work hard out here, they take their recreation seriously too." Ethan nodded toward a group of older men engaged in animated conversation. "Judge Taylor's already organizing the Harvest Festival. It's still months away, but he likes to plan ahead." "And will you attend the Harvest Festival, or will you be out on the trail?" "I try to schedule my freight runs around town events. Don't always succeed, but I make the effort." He gave her a sidelong glance. "Will you still be here for the Harvest Festival?" "Of course. The school term will be well underway by then." "Some teachers don't last through the first winter," Ethan said quietly. "The isolation, the cold, the challenges of frontier life, it's not what many Easterners expect." "I'm not most Easterners." Delilah met his gaze directly. "I came west for a purpose, Ethan. I don't abandon my purposes easily." Something in his expression softened. "No, I don't imagine you do." The moment was interrupted by Judge Taylor, who approached with a middle-aged woman in tow. "Miss Granger, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Hammond, another member of the school board." The introduction led to a discussion of the school schedule, curriculum expectations, and board policies. By the time they finished, the social was winding down, families gathering children and bidding goodnight. "I should get you back to the boarding house," Ethan said as they watched people departing. "You have your meeting with the board in the morning." The walk back was quiet. The streets of Sioux Falls mostly deserted save for the occasional patron stumbling from one of the saloons. The night air was cool but pleasant, stars brilliant in the clear sky above. "Thank you for introducing me around," Delilah said as they reached the boarding house gate. "I feel much more at ease knowing a few faces." "It was my pleasure." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I have a freight run scheduled starting the day after tomorrow, supplies for a new settlement about 4 days' journey west. I'll be gone for about 2 weeks." "Oh." Delilah was surprised by the sharp disappointment she felt. "Well, I'm sure I'll be busy preparing for the school term. I'd like to call on you when I return, if I may." The formality of the request made Delilah smile. "I'd like that." They stood at the gate a moment longer, neither quite ready to part. Finally, Ethan reached for her hand, raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture more courtly than she would have expected from a frontier freighter. "Good night, Delilah." "Good night, Ethan." She watched him walk away, his figure gradually blending with the shadows before turning to enter the boarding house. Mrs. Hollister, predictably, was waiting in the parlor, ostensibly engaged in mending but clearly eager for details. "Did you enjoy the social, dear?" "Very much." Everyone was most welcoming, and Ethan, was he attentive? Delilah felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Archer was a perfect gentleman, of course he was. Mrs. Hollister's knowing smile suggested she had expected nothing less. "You know, in all the years he's been coming to my boarding house for meals, I've never seen him escort a lady to a social event." "We're hardly courting, Mrs. Hollister. He was simply being kind to a newcomer." "If you say so, dear." The landlady's tone made it clear she had her own opinion on the matter. "Will you be seeing him again before he leaves on his freight run?" "How did you know about that?" "Small town, Miss Granger. Everyone knows everyone's business." Mrs. Hollister folded her mending. "He supplies several of the outlying settlements and mining camps. Reliable service, never late with deliveries, never shorts the goods. As I said, he's well respected." Delilah recognized the not-so-subtle message. In a frontier town, a man's reputation was built on his actions, not his family name or social position. By Boston standards, Ethan Archer would have been considered beneath her notice a working man with no distinguished lineage or formal education. Here, he was a valued member of the community, trusted and respected for his character and competence. The realization only increased her admiration for him and her awareness that her own perceptions were still colored by the social hierarchy she had left behind. The meeting with the school board the following morning was straightforward. Judge Taylor and the 4 other members, including Mrs. Hammond from the social, outlined their expectations for the school term, the curriculum requirements, and the salary arrangement. Delilah found them practical and supportive, genuinely concerned with providing the best education possible for the town's children. We understand you'll need time to assess the students' current knowledge before developing your teaching plan, Judge Taylor said as the meeting concluded. The term officially begins in 3 weeks. Will that give you sufficient time to prepare? More than sufficient, Delilah assured him. I'm eager to begin. Excellent. Now, about your living arrangements, the teacher's residence should be completed by next week. In the meantime, the board will cover your expenses at Mrs. Hollister's. As she left the judge's office, Delilah was surprised to find Ethan waiting outside, leaning against a hitching post with casual ease. How did it go? He asked, falling into step beside her. Very well. They seem reasonable in their expectations. Judge Taylor's fair-minded. He wants the school to succeed. Ethan guided her around a muddy spot in the street. I've been thinking before I leave tomorrow I'd like to show you something. Are you free this afternoon? Curiosity piqued. Delilah nodded. I have no other obligations. Good, I'll come for you at 2, wear something suitable for riding. Promptly at 2, Ethan arrived with 2 horses, his buckskin gelding and the sorrel mare Delilah had ridden the previous day. Where are we going? She asked as he helped her mount. You'll see. It's about an hour's ride. He swung up onto his own horse. Thought you might like to see a bit of the surrounding country before you're confined to the schoolhouse. They rode west out of town, following the river for a while before turning north toward a line of low hills. The landscape was different from what Delilah had imagined when thinking of Dakota Territory, not barren plains, but rather a mixture of rolling grasslands, scattered woodlands, and occasional rocky outcroppings. Wildflowers dotted the meadows in splashes of color, and birds wheeled overhead in the clear blue sky. It's beautiful, she said as they paused atop a rise that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside, different from what I expected. Most Easterners expect the West to be all desert or mountains, Ethan replied. They're surprised by the variety. Each region has its own character. They continued riding, Ethan occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the area. He knew the land intimately, the best water sources, the likely places to find game, the natural shelters in case of storms. Finally, they crested a gentle slope to reveal a small valley nestled between 2 hills. A clear stream ran through it, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. Near the stream stood the beginnings of a structure, the foundation and partial frame of what would eventually be a cabin. What is this place? Delilah asked as they dismounted. Mine. The single word held a wealth of pride and hope. This is the land I've been saving for. 200 acres with water rights and good grazing. He led her toward the partially built cabin, pointing out the features of the land as they walked the sheltered position of the building site, the rich soil near the stream, the natural meadow where horses could graze. It's perfect for raising horses, he explained, his enthusiasm evident. Protected from the worst winter winds, good water year-round, enough flat ground for corrals and barns eventually. You've put a lot of thought into this. Had plenty of time to think riding the trails. He gestured toward the cabin frame. Started building last month, working on it when I'm not on freight runs. It's slow going alone, but I'll have the roof on before winter. Delilah walked around the site, trying to envision the finished home. It wasn't large, perhaps 2 or 3 rooms at most, but the location was ideal, with views of the valley and hills beyond. Why did you want to show me this? She asked finally. Ethan seemed almost embarrassed by the question. Thought you might like to know that not everyone in Sioux Falls is just passing through. Some of us are building something permanent. The implied reassurance touched her. He had sensed her uncertainty about the transient nature of frontier life and wanted to show her that stability was possible, that people did put down roots here. Thank you for bringing me, she said softly. It helps to see someone investing in the future of this place. They spent another hour exploring the property, Ethan pointing out his plans for expansion where the barn would stand, the route for a better access road. The area he intended to fence first for the horses he hoped to acquire. His vision was clear and practical. the dream of a man who had spent years observing what worked and what didn't in frontier living. As they prepared to ride back to town, Delilah found herself reluctant to leave. There was something peaceful about this hidden valley, something that spoke to her own desire for a place that was truly hers. "When do you think you'll be able to live here?" she asked as they mounted their horses. "Not until next spring at the earliest." "Need to finish the cabin, dig a proper well, build at least a small corral and shelter for the horses." He glanced at the sky, gauging the time. "For now, my room in town is adequate." The ride back was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Sioux Falls, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I leave at dawn tomorrow," Ethan said as they neared the boarding house. "The settlement I'm supplying is new, mostly miners and a few families trying to establish a foothold. They're counting on these provisions." "How dangerous is the journey?" Delilah asked, suddenly concerned. "Not particularly, as long as the weather holds. The trail's well marked these days and I know the route." He smiled slightly. "I won't be trapped by any falling trees if that's what you're worried about." "That would be ironic, considering how we met." They had reached the boarding house. As Ethan helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, Delilah felt an unexpected surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something more complex that she wasn't ready to name. "Be safe," she said simply. "Always am." He hesitated, then added, "I'll call on you when I return if I may." "I'd like that very much." For a moment they stood in silence, neither quite ready to part. Then Ethan reached for her hand, much as he had the previous night, but instead of the formal gesture she expected, he simply held it in both of his. "You're going to be a fine teacher, Delilah Granger. Sioux Falls is fortunate to have you." Before she could respond, he had released her hand, mounted his horse, and with a final nod, ridden away toward the livery stable. Delilah watched until he disappeared around a corner, aware that in just a few days, this man had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Delilah moved into the teacher's residence, which was completed ahead of schedule. She organized the schoolhouse, developed lesson plans, and met with parents who brought their children to be introduced to the new teacher. Everyone was welcoming, though she sensed some were reserving judgment until they saw how she handled the challenges of frontier education. Judge Taylor provided her with the school records left by Miss Abernathy, which helped Delilah understand the range of abilities she would be dealing with. The older students had received reasonably consistent instruction before the previous teacher's departure, but the younger ones would need significant attention to establish fundamental skills. She found herself thinking of Ethan often, wondering where he was on his journey, whether he was safe, when exactly he might return. Mrs. Hollister, with whom she still took dinner twice a week, was full of thinly veiled hints about the freighter's apparent interest in the new schoolteacher. "He's never shown a cabin in progress to any other lady in town," she remarked during one such meal. "Not even when Widow Johnson was practically throwing her daughter at him last year. Perhaps he simply wanted to show me that Sioux Falls has permanent residents," Delilah suggested, though she suspected there had been more to the gesture. "Perhaps," Mrs. Hollister agreed, not bothering to hide her skepticism. "Or perhaps he wanted you to see the future he's building. A future that might have room for more than just horses." Delilah changed the subject, unwilling to speculate aloud about Ethan's intentions. Whatever his reasons for showing her the property, she had been touched by the gesture and impressed by his clear vision for the future. The school term began with 31 students, 3 more than anticipated, as a family had recently moved to the area with school-age children. As Delilah had expected, the educational levels varied widely, from children who could barely recognize letters to a 16-year-old boy who read Latin with reasonable fluency, thanks to his father's instruction. Organizing the classroom into appropriate learning groups required all her creativity and patience. She established a system whereby older, more advanced students helped instruct younger ones in basic skills, freeing her to work with those who needed specialized attention. By the end of the first week, Delilah was exhausted but exhilarated. The children were indeed lively, as Mrs. Peterson had warned, but they were also eager to learn and respectful of her authority once she demonstrated both competence and fairness. Ethan had been gone for 16 days, 2 days longer than anticipated, when Delilah heard the distinctive sound of freight wagons rumbling down Main Street late one afternoon as she was dismissing her students. The children immediately recognized the sound as well. "Mr. Archer's back," announced young Tommy Peterson, rushing to the window. "Ma says he always brings peppermint sticks when he returns from a long haul." Sure enough, 2 heavily laden wagons were making their way toward the mercantile, driven by Ethan and another man Delilah didn't recognize. Ethan looked tired but unharmed, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, his shirt and trousers covered in the dust of the trail. Delilah felt a rush of relief and pleasure at the sight of him, though she tried to maintain a dignified demeanor in front of her pupils. "Yes, that appears to be Mr. Archer returning from his freight run," she said calmly. "Now, please remember to complete your arithmetic exercises for tomorrow, and those of you in the advanced reading group should finish Chapter 3 of your history text." The children scattered, many running toward the mercantile in hopes that the rumor of peppermint sticks would prove true. Delilah remained at the schoolhouse, organizing materials for the next day's lessons and definitely not watching through the window for any sign of Ethan approaching. It was nearly dusk when she heard footsteps on the schoolhouse porch. The door opened to reveal Ethan, still trail dusty but with his hat in his hands and a small package tucked under one arm. "Miss Granger," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the formality. "Hope I'm not interrupting your preparations." "Not at all, Mr. Archer. Welcome back to Sioux Falls." Delilah was surprised by how steady her voice sounded when her pulse was anything but steady. "I trust your journey was successful, mostly." Trail was washed out and one section had to find an alternate route, which added a couple of days. He stepped further into the schoolhouse, looking around with interest. "You've made some changes." Delilah nodded, gesturing toward the new arrangement of desks and the educational charts she had created and hung on the walls. "I've tried to organize the space to accommodate different learning levels. It looks good." He shifted slightly, seeming almost nervous. "I brought you something. From the settlement, there's a woman there who makes these." He held out the small package, curious. Delilah unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden box, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, with delicate flower designs carved into the lid. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "Thought it might be useful for keeping chalk or pen nibs or whatever teachers need to keep organized," Ethan explained, watching her reaction closely. "It's perfect. Thank you." Delilah placed the box carefully on her desk, aware that this was no casual gesture but a deliberate gift, the action of a man with intentions beyond mere friendship. "I heard the school term started well," Ethan continued, moving to examine the books on the shelf. "Mrs. Hollister says you've already got the troublemakers in line," Delilah laughed. "I wouldn't say that exactly, but we're establishing a working relationship. The children are bright and eager to learn for the most part. And how are you finding life in Sioux Falls, living up to your expectations?" "It's better than I expected, actually. The community is supportive, the accommodations are comfortable, and the work is challenging in the best way." She met his gaze directly. "I made the right decision in coming west." Something in his expression softened at her words. "I'm glad to hear it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the lengthening shadows creating a sense of intimacy in the schoolhouse. "I should let you finish your work," Ethan finally said, though he made no move toward the door. "But I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening, to celebrate your successful first week of teaching." The invitation was clear and deliberate, not a casual meal between acquaintances, but a formal supper with implied meaning. "I would be delighted," Delilah replied, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect. "Good, I'll call for you at 6. He placed his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly. "Good night, Delilah." "Good night, Ethan." After he left, Delilah found herself unable to concentrate on her lesson preparations. The wooden box sat on her desk, a tangible reminder of Ethan's thoughtfulness. He had been in a remote settlement, focused on his business, yet had taken the time to select a gift specifically for her. The following evening, Delilah took particular care with her appearance, wearing her best dress, a deep green wool that complemented her fair coloring, and arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. Mrs. Hollister, who had stopped by the teacher's residence ostensibly to deliver some freshly baked bread, made no effort to hide her approval. "That color suits you," she remarked, eyeing the dress. "And I'm glad to see you wearing your hair that way. Too many young women think they must look severe to be taken seriously as teachers." Ethan arrived promptly at 6, dressed in what was clearly his best, a dark suit that, while not fashionable by Boston standards, was well made and properly fitted. He had trimmed his beard and tamed his usually unruly hair, and there was a nervousness in his manner that Delilah found endearing. "You look beautiful," he said simply as she opened the door. "Thank you. You're quite handsome yourself." The hotel restaurant was the most elegant establishment in Sioux Falls, with tablecloths, proper silverware, and a menu that offered more than the standard frontier fare of beans and salt pork. As Ethan escorted her to a corner table, Delilah was aware of the curious glances from other diners. Sioux Falls' most eligible bachelor dining with the new schoolteacher was clearly a matter of community interest. "I hope you don't mind being the subject of town gossip," Ethan said quietly as he held her chair. "People here take a keen interest in their neighbor's business." "I've noticed," Delilah replied with a smile. "Mrs. Hollister has been particularly informative." Ethan chuckled. "I can imagine. She's been trying to marry me off for years." "And has she had any success?" Delilah asked, keeping her tone light despite the sudden importance of his answer. "Not until now." The simple statement hung between them, its implications clear. The waiter's arrival provided a momentary distraction as they ordered roast beef for Ethan, chicken for Delilah, with apple pie promised for dessert. When they were alone again, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I want to be clear about my intentions, Delilah. I'm not a man for games or pretense. I admire you greatly, your courage in coming west alone, your dedication to teaching, your adaptability to frontier life. I would like to court you properly if you're willing." The directness of his declaration took Delilah by surprise, though in retrospect, it was entirely in keeping with his character. Ethan Archer was a man who valued straightforward dealing in all aspects of life. "I would like that," she replied, matching his honesty with her own. "But I should be equally clear, I came west to establish myself independently. I'm not looking for marriage as an escape or a shortcut. I wouldn't want you any other way." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I'm looking for a partner, Delilah, not a dependent. Someone who chooses me because she wants to, not because she needs to." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as their food arrived: Ethan's freight business, Delilah's students, the town's plans for the upcoming harvest festival. Yet underlying the casual exchange was the awareness that something significant had changed between them, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings and intentions that would shape their future interactions. As Ethan walked her home after dinner, the evening air cool and filled with the scent of autumn approaching, Delilah found herself more content than she had been in years. The path ahead was uncertain in many ways, but for the first time she was truly charting her own course, making choices based on her own desires rather than external expectations. At her door, Ethan took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "May I call on you Sunday after church? Perhaps go for a ride if the weather's fair." "I'd like that very much." He hesitated, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her cheek, a gesture that managed to be both respectful and intimate. "Good night, Delilah." "Good night, Ethan." Inside her small home, Delilah touched her cheek where his lips had been, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This was not at all what she had expected when she left Boston, but perhaps that was the greatest gift of the frontier: the freedom to discover possibilities beyond one's original imaginings. The courtship that followed was conducted with the same straightforward honesty that characterized their initial understanding. Ethan called on Delilah regularly, taking her riding on Sunday afternoons, escorting her to church and town socials, occasionally bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, once a length of pretty ribbon he had acquired on a freight run to Yankton. Delilah, for her part, maintained her independence while welcoming his attention. She continued to establish herself as a respected teacher, developing innovative approaches to frontier education that even the most traditional parents came to appreciate. When Ethan was away on freight runs, she focused on her work and her growing circle of friends in the community. When he returned, she delighted in his company and the deepening connection between them. As autumn progressed, Ethan spent more time working on his land, trying to complete the cabin before winter set in. He adjusted his freight schedule to allow for longer periods in Sioux Falls and often invited Delilah to ride out with him to see the progress. "The roof's on," he announced proudly during one such visit in late October. "Windows are installed too, still need to finish the interior, but it's weather-tight now." The cabin was indeed taking shape, a solid two-room structure with a stone fireplace and proper wooden floors. Each visit revealed new improvements: shelves built into the walls, a cast iron stove installed for cooking, a hand-dug well providing fresh water. "You've accomplished so much on your own," Delilah remarked as they stood in what would eventually be the main living area. "Had some help with the heavy work. Judge Taylor and a few others came out for a day to help with the roof raising." Ethan ran his hand along the smooth plank of a windowsill. "But yes, most of it's been just me, working when I can between freight runs." He looked around the space, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Next spring I'll start on the barn and corrals. By summer I should be ready for the first horses." "And will you live here then?" Delilah asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Ethan turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether I'll be living here alone." The implication was clear, though he didn't elaborate further. Instead, he showed her the second room, smaller than the main one but with a window facing east to catch the morning light. "Thought this could be a good place for books," he said, gesturing around the empty space. "Gets good light for reading." The suggestion that he was considering her preferences in the design of his home touched Delilah deeply. This wasn't just Ethan's dream he was building, but potentially a shared future, one that would accommodate both his ambitions and hers. As winter settled over Dakota Territory, bringing bitter cold and snow that sometimes closed the school for days at a time, Ethan and Delilah's courtship continued to deepen. His freight runs became less frequent, the hazardous winter conditions making long journeys impractical. Instead, he focused on shorter hauls and helping with community projects in Sioux Falls, repairing the church roof after a particularly violent storm, assisting elderly residents with firewood, organizing a Christmas celebration for the schoolchildren. On Christmas Eve, following a simple but festive program at the school in which her pupils performed recitations and songs for their parents, Ethan presented Delilah with a special gift, a silver locket containing a small photograph of the two of them, taken by a traveling photographer who had visited Sioux Falls in November. "So you'll always have a reminder, even when I'm away on the trail," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Delilah touched the locket gently, moved by the sentiment behind the gift. "It's beautiful, Ethan, thank you." Her gift to him was practical but personal, a leather-bound journal with his initials tooled into the cover and a good fountain pen. "For recording your travels and plans," she explained. "You have such a clear vision for the future, it should be preserved." They stood together on the porch of her small house, the cold air crystallizing their breath, stars brilliant in the clear winter sky above. Ethan's arms around her provided warmth and a sense of rightness that still sometimes surprised Delilah. When he kissed her, no longer the chaste pecks on the cheek of their early courtship, but proper kisses that spoke of deeper feelings, she responded with equal fervor, no longer concerned about the propriety that would have constrained her in Boston. By early spring, their intentions toward each other were well established, though no formal announcement had been made. The town watched their courtship with approving interest, many openly speculating about when, not if, the freighter and the schoolteacher would marry. Delilah, for her part, was in no rush. She had committed to completing the school year, and there was satisfaction in seeing her pupils' progress under her guidance. Some of the older students who had initially been skeptical of an Eastern lady's ability to teach practical knowledge were now among her strongest supporters, especially after she organized a series of presentations by local experts on frontier skills, including one memorable session in which Ethan demonstrated how to navigate using natural landmarks when maps were unavailable. The snow had barely melted when Ethan resumed work on his property with renewed vigor. The cabin interior was completed, first walls finished, floors sanded smooth, simple furniture installed. Then came the barn, a sturdy structure designed to house several horses and provide storage for hay and equipment. By late April, he had begun constructing the corral fencing, enlisting help from friends in town for the more labor-intensive aspects. Delilah rode out whenever her teaching schedule allowed, sometimes bringing a picnic lunch to share with Ethan and whoever else might be helping that day. She found herself increasingly thinking of the property not as Ethan's land, but as the land, a subtle shift in perspective that reflected her growing investment in the future it represented. It was during one such visit in early May, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, that Ethan finally asked the question that had been implicit in their relationship for months. "Delilah," he began, taking her hand in his, "I built this place with a dream in mind, a dream of horses grazing in that meadow, of seasons changing over this valley, of building something that would last." He paused, his eyes holding her steadily. "But over these past months, that dream has expanded to include you. I can't imagine this future without you sharing it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a simple gold band with a modest diamond set in the center. "This was my mother's. My uncle kept it for me after she died, gave it to me when I left to make my own way. I've carried it for years, waiting for the right moment, the right woman." Dropping to one knee before her, Ethan held up the ring. "Delilah Granger, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need a husband or I need a wife, but because together, we could build something better than either of us could alone." Delilah looked at the man kneeling before her, a man whose strength and kindness had been evident from the moment. He promised a stranger trapped behind a fallen tree that she would walk free before nightfall. A man who had shown her respect, admiration, and eventually love without ever attempting to diminish her independence or redirect her ambitions. "Yes," she said simply, joy filling her heart. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Archer." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, Delilah realized that she had found in the Dakota wilderness what had eluded her in civilized Boston, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. They were married on the last day of the school term in early June, in a ceremony that seemed to involve the entire town of Sioux Falls. Judge Taylor officiated, Mrs. Hollister wept openly, and Delilah's students formed an honor guard, tossing wildflower petals as the newlyweds emerged from the church. The celebration that followed at the town hall included music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the county. Toasts were offered to the new couple, to the school's successful year, to the future prosperity of Sioux Falls. Through it all, Ethan remained at Delilah's side, his pride and happiness evident in every glance, every touch, every smile directed at his new wife. That evening, as they rode together toward their land, now truly their land, Delilah reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. Had her horse not spooked during that spring storm a year earlier, had that massive oak not fallen across the ravine, had Ethan not happened to be riding nearby, any single change might have resulted in a completely different outcome. The cabin welcomed them home with the golden light of sunset streaming through the western windows. Inside, Delilah found evidence of careful preparation: fresh wildflowers in a pottery vase on the table, new curtains at the windows, likely Mrs. Hollister's contribution, a colorful quilt on the bed that she recognized as the handiwork of several town women. "Welcome home, Mrs. Archer," Ethan said softly, drawing her into his arms. "It's perfect," Delilah replied, looking around at the simple but comfortable space that would be the foundation of their life together. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered new dimensions to their relationship, the physical expression of the love that had grown between them over the past year. In Ethan's gentle strength and passionate devotion, Delilah found a completion she hadn't known she was seeking. In her responsive warmth and unabashed joy, Ethan found the perfect partner for the life he had envisioned. Summer passed in a blur of activity as they established their new home. Ethan continued his freight business, but organized his routes to limit his time away. Delilah prepared for the next school year, developing new approaches based on what she had learned during her first year of teaching. Together, they acquired their first horses, 2 proven broodmares, and a young stallion with impressive bloodlines, the beginning of what they hoped would eventually become a successful breeding operation. By the time autumn painted the hills in russet and gold, their home had expanded to include a proper vegetable garden, chickens for eggs, and plans for further improvements. The community of Sioux Falls continued to grow as well, with the promised railroad finally reaching the town, bringing increased commerce and new settlers. Winter found them settled into a comfortable routine, Ethan handling the livestock and maintenance of their property, Delilah dividing her time between teaching and homemaking. The long, cold evenings were spent planning for the future, reading aloud from their growing collection of books, or simply enjoying each other's company before the fireplace. When spring arrived again, bringing new growth to the valley and fresh possibilities, it brought another beginning as well, the news that Delilah was expecting their first child, due in early autumn. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked as they stood on their porch one evening, his arms wrapped protectively around her still flat stomach, the sunset gilding the new leaves of the cottonwoods by the stream. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Delilah replied honestly. "When I left Boston, I was seeking independence, a chance to build my own life. What I found was so much more partnership, purpose, love." Ethan tightened his embrace, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. "You know, I've been thinking about that day we met, if that tree hadn't fallen. If that tree hadn't fallen, I wouldn't have been trapped in that ravine," Delilah finished, "and you wouldn't have had the opportunity to rescue me with that confident promise that I'd walk free before nightfall. One of the best promises I ever made," Ethan murmured. "Though not the most important." Delilah turned in his arms to face him, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "Which was the one I made at our wedding, to love and cherish you all the days of my life." His blue eyes, still as clear and honest as the day they met, held hers steadily. "That's the promise that matters most." As the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Delilah stood in the circle of her husband's arms, surrounded by the home they had built together, carrying the child that would be part of their shared future. The path that had brought her here had been unexpected, from trapped behind a fallen tree to freedom in all the ways that mattered, but she wouldn't have changed a single step of the journey. Their daughter, Emily, was born as autumn leaves began to fall, a healthy child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. She grew into a lively toddler who loved to help with the horses and insisted on accompanying her mother to school whenever possible. 2 years later, a son joined the family, Thomas, named for Ethan's father. As their children grew, so did their horse breeding operation, gradually earning a reputation for quality stock throughout the territory. Delilah continued teaching until the demands of family and ranch became too great to balance, then channeled her educational passion into establishing a small lending library for the town. Over the years, they faced challenges: harsh winters that threatened their livestock, economic downturns that affected the horse market, illness that swept through the community, but they faced them together. The partnership forged in their earliest days, growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on their porch watching the stars emerge, Ethan would take Delilah's hand and say, "Remember that fallen tree?" And she would smile, remembering the rain and mud and fear, but more importantly, the steady voice that had promised, "You'll walk free before nightfall." It had been the beginning of a journey neither could have anticipated, from strangers meeting in a moment of crisis to partners building a life rich in purpose and love. A journey that proved some obstacles, like fallen trees, are not endings but beginnings, the first step on a path to something better than either could have imagined alone.